Having discussed that, I now want to jump topics a little bit. Oh, well, not fully. I did want to point out that the name for the people who hunted whales was Ahuhuslet, which means basically the shamans who hunt whales. So worth pointing out as well. Subsistence as a whole, as you would probably gather, was heavily focused on aquatic mammals, especially land animals, but also hunting of seabirds, which there would have been and are a tremendous amount of in that area. As you're no doubt aware, that whole kind of traditional Sugpiaq area is also migratory flyways for a variety of different birds as they go up north into northern Alaska. There would have been a lot of eating traditionally of cod, halibut, scalpin, and of course, even though traditional ways have changed a lot, there still is a lot of heavy involvement for a lot of Sugpiaq communities in fishing for your food and also in sort of commercial fishing as a way of life, an economic way of life for a lot of people. By the way, this is a caribou skin parka. It's a replica of one, again, thanks to Alutiiq Museum. And that parka, that caribou skin parka, it's worth pointing out that that was one of the things that would often be traded between Sugpiaq and Dena'ina communities, because Dena'ina communities, their homeland, would have had larger areas where there were caribou, like more of those inland flats areas. And so that was often a trading item, right? So trading for whale meat and caribou skins, for example, is kind of a simplified way of explaining it, and other kinds of things as well. In addition to that, I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of sacred ceremonies. And as I do so, I want to emphasize that I'm not an expert on Sugpiaq traditional religiosity. I do know some things, but I do not claim to be the be-all and all on that. There's so much to know and so little relatively that I have to share with you today, but I did want to share a few things that I think are really interesting, and I do hope I really want to show them justice. When we talk about people's sacred traditions, it's critical we do so in a way that's really respectful. It is worth pointing out, just to give you some context here, that most Sugpiaq people today are Christian, or at least a large percentage are Christian, and that has been the case for hundreds of years. And there's actually been some good writings on this where people kind of bring up the way in which people kind of made Christianity their own and kind of melded it with Sugpiaq ways of thinking. But in any case, that is generally speaking how most people approach spirituality today if they are spiritual. Traditionally, there was a very different religious practice that pre-existed Christianity. And some of those practices, even as Christianity became dominant, some of those practices still persisted. So one of those practices, though, historically that was done was called the Feast of the Dead. And this was done annually in August in the Prince William Sound Chugach Sugpiaq communities. And basically it would be this kind of annual celebration for people that had passed away that year. And there would be like several days, like a week or multiple, of singing, of dancing, and of people wearing these masks. So within Sugpiaq context, in Sugpiaq context, the masks traditionally were ways of representing spirits and also connecting with the spiritual world. And so as an example of that, even to this day, there was a great news story about this a while back, but even to this day, still occasionally people will do this. And it's kind of, I think, had a bit of a revitalization, but the idea that the masks are kind of connected to the dead, and that after a funeral, a traditional funeral, you also do a mask burning ceremony where there's like a mask that is kind of observes people for a few months or a few weeks and sees kind of how things are going after the loved one has departed, and then that mask sort of represents them or the connection to them, and then the mask is burned at the end of that. And one person, Alutiiq person, described it as, in this news article that was written a few years ago, said, you know, sometimes we don't get a last moment with the dead, right? That happens maybe for one reason or another, or the last thing you said to them may not have been very positive. This mask burning ceremony allows us to have a definitive kind of connection to them still, and then it's a final moment, right? And we know when that final moment is because of the mask burning ceremony. So this masks then have a really important role within Sugpiaq society traditionally. Perry Eaton has written about this. These are a few examples of Sugpiaq masks. As you can see, like beautiful constructions traditionally, right? And one that tend to use a lot of, among other things, seabird feathers as a way of sort of accentuating the features, and oftentimes intentionally having sort of exaggerated human features as part of representing the spirit world or historical beings with these mask or Ginarukak Sugpiaq masks. Back to the Feast of the Dead, one other thing I wanted to mention is that during these annual feasts for the dead, you would invite other people from other villages, perhaps less well-off villages, to your village for this kind of remembrance of these people we've lost. And a lot of times, among other things, people would give to the poor as a way of honoring the dead, and they would also burn some items as a way of like sending that above, like sending that to the spirit world. So all of this is just really kind of beautiful, I think, and really interesting, and I wanted to share with you. I wanted to share a little bit too about Sugpiaq or Alutiiq storytelling. You'll see that I'm occasionally using the term Alutiiq. That's still a term that a lot of people use in describing themselves, and so I try to kind of switch back and forth a little bit between the two, even though Sugpiaq is the endonym. But in any case, Dr. Alicia Drebeck wrote a dissertation, Litukut Sugpiaqtun. It's a longer title than that, but that's the short version. And she talks about the fact that traditionally Sugpiaq stories were divided between Unequat and Quailiyangwat. So basically, you kind of had stories about the world, how it came to be, these kind of sacred foundational stories. And then you also had stories that were more kind of historical stories of people that are not sort of, that are considered to be like true factual, perhaps more recent history. And, you know, she said something really interesting in that dissertation. She points out that when you look at the word Quiliyangwat, it sounds like it's etymologically similar. What I mean by that is that the word seems to have a root word of quile, which means like from above. And she says that's the idea that like stories come from above seems to be what's being suggested there in the traditional way of life or the traditional belief. And similarly, the word for foundational stories, it seems to be related to word unite, which is like left over, or another word unikut, so towards the sea. So this idea of sort of the stories come from the ocean and that they're things that remain from our ancestors. And as she points out, a lot of times these first category of creation stories or stories of how the world came to be are no longer considered as fact, partly because people have changed to a different sacred story several hundred years ago, right? So a lot of people would regard Genesis creation story, or for other reasons, people might no longer regard these as fact of how the world came to be, but some people might. And in any case, traditionally, this would have been a key part of how people understood the world to have come to be. Those stories, if you look at them, they vary, but I have a book in my lab called Chugach Legends, which you can probably find in a lot of libraries around here. But if you look at it and you read the stories, it's from several different elders that were recorded by Birgit Smith and De Laguna, a couple of famous anthropologists, and some other people. But when you look at them, it's kind of fascinating to see the key themes. So Chugach migration, how the different villages started in Prince William Sound. There's several stories about sort of how people spread around Prince William Sound and around the Alutiiq areas. But then you have a lot of stories that are related to fighting. So the fight with the Tenaina, the slaughter of the Yakutat at Alutiiq, the massacre of St. Elias Rock. The fight with the Tanana story is interesting because it presents it as if the Tenaina people, or Dena'ina people as we would say now, had been attacking Sugpiaq villages in that story, whereas Dena'ina's story or oral history tends to go the other way of representing them as being raided by other groups. And so, but there's this acknowledgement that there was warfare between groups. Again, not full on, I'm going to take over your land warfare, or I'm going to wipe out your people warfare, more like small scale warfare that usually ended pretty quickly, small scale battles. The mountain goat hunt in Sheep Bay, the deceived husband, the woman who liked liver. So some of these are very kind of practical everyday things, but a lot of them are about animals. Or so the blind boy and the loon, which by the way has a very similar story to an Inupiat story. So this shows you that kind of stories were probably being shared between groups up and down the Alaskan coast. The girl who married a dog, the girl who married a bear, how the dog came to men, etc. I'm just going to read you one or two that I think are okay to share and that I think you'll find really interesting. The first one is How the Dog Came to Men, told by a Alutiiq storyteller named Makari, who was actually a chief, and his full name is Chief Makari or Makaka Feodorovich Chimovitsky. And he said originally the dog was wild and lived among the wild animals, but he was always giggling and thus betrayed the hiding places of the animals. Therefore, they sewed the dog's mouth together, but he giggled so much that the seam was torn. That is why the dog has such a big mouth. The animals chased the dog away, but the dog said, "Now you chase me away, but I am going to avenge myself and trace you when the people are hunting you." So this is kind of a common theme in Alaska Native storytelling, particularly here in the South Central area, where dogs are considered very important and to have a kind of a special and unique relationship with human beings that's different even than the close relationship with other kinds of animals. And also you have this idea of sort of the sacred events far, far deep in time can then affect how things look in the present. Similarly, there's a story about Ikluitsta or Raven, who's generally, we sometimes say like a cheater or trickster. Sometimes he also does really good and important things in the stories. But in any case, Raven, there's this story where he's going to marry a harlequin duck, who's a beautifully plumaged kind of duck that has kind of a white crest. And she's like painting him, but then she doesn't get done. And she has to like go do something else. So he's like, "It's okay, just cover me with charcoal." And so the idea is sort of that's why Raven looks the way that he does now. And so a lot of times these stories about animals can help kind of talk to and explain how animals came to be, how they came to look, how they may have acted historically, and especially this theme of sort of animals and humans as interacting closely historically in a way that perhaps they don't anymore. The final story that I wanted to share with you is, I can find it. Where did that go? By the way, a lot of these Chugachmut stories will talk about blackfish, and you're like, what the heck is blackfish? And why is it in so many stories? Blackfish is how as were traditionally referred to, or killer whales. But the one I wanted to find was on page 63. Okay, good. Skunk Cabbage and Water Lily, also by Makari. It says there was a village below Nunaykutuk called Nunaranarite. In the summer, a great many children came over there were skunk cabbages and water lilies. They were friendly to each other, and every summer many children were coming. When they grew up and were old enough, they said to each other, "I suppose it would be better if we get married." So they intermarried. And then the people of Nunaranarite were all kinds of bushes. Skunk cabbage was a man, water lily a woman. Skunk cabbage died, but water lily lived until the ice came. The roots of skunk cabbage and water lily were their parents. Water lily's father and mother said, "We do not like that your husband dies right away." He did not really die. His roots were still alive, but they did not like the idea. They told water lily to leave her husband. When winter comes, skunk cabbage dies entirely, but water lily lives on. Her roots are far down, but skunk cabbage always dies, even in the swamps. So it's kind of telling you information about how skunk cabbage and water lily as plants live, like what their life cycle is during the year, but doing so in a way where the plants traditionally were thought of as beings, right, as living beings, and when you and with sentience, with consciousness, and when you think of it that way, it starts to make more starts to make you kind of rethink how we pick berries and things like that, right? If you start to try to get into that mindset of understanding the traditional stories and sort of plants as a type of people.